All right. So the last time we spoke, we looked at getting access as well as creating a new role group. What are we going to be taking a look at today?
Yeah, hey Day. Today we're going to be looking at the operation of adding a role group to a member. Oh, sorry, adding a member to a role group, other way around. This is important because obviously this could be a method of achieving persistence, as it says, right? Because if you have a compromised user and you're adding them to like a privileged group, even if you reset their password, you could potentially compromise them again, and then you've still got those high permissions. So that's what we mean by when we say persistence. If this was to occur, there's a few initial questions you would have. So firstly, you'd want to know what role group were they added to, and if that role group has any interesting or really privileged roles. So that's what we're going to explore.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks. So firstly, we did cover this in previous parts, but you want to make sure that you have access to the audit log. You can follow step 1 to get access to it. You want to do a search add role group member operation. So if you look at the screenshot, that's the operation name you would want to search for. Obviously, you can choose your date and time and other filter criteria here, but the main thing you want is this operation to bring up the event that we're going to be looking at. So very quickly, we touched on sort of record types in the last part. The record type here, once again, is Exchange admin, and that's the record type for all the activities that occur within Exchange Admin Center. So things like adding a member to a role group, but also, modifying someone's mailbox. If it's done from an admin level, it's going to be in this record type. And if we very quickly look at this screenshot here, this is kind of how the audit event is actually presented. And we'll go through this and see, what are the key fields and if any fields we need to decipher. But you can see things, you can see, for example, the add role group member as an operation. You can see the time and date when it was done. You can see the IP address, which we'll come back to. You can see the user ID, and you can see some parameters which we'll explore as well, along with some other fields that aren't as interesting, but they're still here. So sort of stepping through these, initially, the first 4 fields that I like to kind of identify and explain, these are kind of generic fields across all the operations, or at least majority of them. So creation time. So we know when the user was added, right? So from a forensics perspective, we exactly can pinpoint to say on the 30th of July at 6:27, the user was added, right? The user ID, from this, we know that the user was added to the role group by this domain. Obviously, this account, sorry, I've obviously redacted this, but this would be, typically a user account in your tenant. So you could then see if that's like an admin gone rogue or an insider threat or a threat actor based on the user ID. The result status, we can see that this is true. If I bring up the image side by side, maybe that will kind of help. So you can see result status true here. I should have had some annotation thing here, but maybe you can circle that in the edit. But basically, result status true. So that shows that the command executed successfully, because that could fail, right? If the user didn't have enough permissions, or, maybe there was some network block and they weren't allowed to succeed, then, it would show failure. But in this case, it shows true. An IP address, so I touched on this earlier. The IP address here, 4.231. This value here, this is actually a Microsoft IP in Dublin. So in this case, what we can see is the IP of the service, i.e. the actual server that formed this change, not the IP of the device, right? In future operations, we will see the client IP as being like the device IP, which I've redacted obviously for sensitivity purposes. But if you were to execute those operations, then you'd get a bit more of a meaningful IP. But in this case, you're getting the server, remember and bear in mind.
Gotcha. I wanted to ask for the result
Sure.
status, right? Because the true basically shows that it was successful. So let's say it's false, and it signifies that it failed. Does it also come with a sort of error message that tells you why it failed?
Not in the audit log itself. So within here, there's not like a reason for result status, etc. But if you're the one executing the command, so let's say you're doing it legitimately and it gives you an error, then in PowerShell, it will kind of output something. Like as an example, so let's say I do get user and I just make up a user that I know isn't in my tenant, right? So this will probably fail with some sort of error message, hopefully. Yeah. So this is what you'd get, right? But if a threat actor was to perform this, or an insider threat was to perform this, you wouldn't see this output. And maybe that's something Microsoft could look to add. But at the moment, currently, you wouldn't get that in the audit log.
That
So you
makes
wouldn't know
sense.
exactly what the error message was, but you would just know that it failed. And that may not be fully enough, but at least you could say the threat was kind of mitigated because the attack failed. The command didn't run, basically.
Right. That makes sense. I asked because I know that in some other login solutions for different environments or cloud environments or SaaS platforms, they tell you when it failed and also give you the details about why it failed, like the error details within the log itself. So I was curious as to if Microsoft actually allows you to log those details.
Yeah, no, not for this one, not for any Exchange admin that I've seen. When I've had result status failed, it just shows failed. It's up to you to kind of troubleshoot but maybe that's something they could look to add as they sort of enhance this capability.
Gotcha.
But no, great question. And then the other useful field, right? So there's an app ID property. So if we go back to the screenshot, you can see here app ID 497. Again, this is some random GUID, right? As we
Yeah.
mentioned in the last part, there's a lot of kind of these deciphering elements that you have to do, which is why obviously the series is called Deciphering UAL. But in this case, there's actually a handy page here, which your users or your audience, sorry, can search for, or maybe we can link to in the description. But this will basically kind of resolve those application ID to meaningful names. So if we were to take this string, this 497, and just do a control F, you will see that this resolves to the Exchange Admin Center. So this is helpful because this tells you that the action was performed through the Exchange Admin Center. Another value you could see is maybe PowerShell, right? So there is like I think REST API, yeah, here. So if you were to see this string instead, then you would know that the attacker or rogue admin or whoever performed it through PowerShell. But in this
Yeah.
case, they've done it through the Exchange Admin Center.
Right.
So that's why the app ID is an important field.
Yeah, I think when we had a initial conversation, you said you're somewhat familiar with Sentinel, right?
Yeah.
So, do you think this is something like, those details, those app IDs against their actual application names? Is this something you could possibly put into a reference table if you're building out detections and then use it to populate the detections automatically, or even just like build it into your login solution as to where whenever things are logged, if it sees that particular application ID, it automatically maps it to the actual application name.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. So in Sentinel, you've got something called watch lists, which is basically like a CSV. So you can have, yeah, exactly what you said, column name of like application name, column name of ID. And then in the analytic rule, you can say for these IDs, give me the name.
Mm.
Or you could do a further detection to say if it's not one of these expected application IDs, then flag an alert.
Yeah.
And in Splunk, you could ingest it as a CSV and then basically do, I don't know the exact command, but something like a lookup to basically resolve those names to IDs. But the thing to the IDs to the names. But the thing to bear in mind is that is a static list, right? So there's almost
Yeah.
like a maintenance effort there to kind of keep an eye on this page or, add any IDs that you find yourself. One thing, since we're on the topic, is prior to like last week, the security center, if I just search for security and compliance, this value here wasn't there.
Oh,
We'll
wow.
come to this in a minute, but I actually raised a pull request to update this in the Microsoft Docs, which has now been accepted, and this value is here. But up
Nice.
until then, this value was just not present in the table. So if someone saw this app ID and control F on this page, they wouldn't find it, right? And again, what I find without kind of going too much into that, and maybe we'll cover that in a future part, but it's just a default application. Like it's visible in Entra ID. So why wouldn't Microsoft just lift and shift it and put it into the doc,
Yeah.
right? So what I mean with the watch list is it's kind of then you'd need some sort of owner there or team management or something to basically maintain that list. Because if in future they were to change like the Exchange one that we saw, then your alert may fire, but it may still be the Exchange Admin Center, but you just don't know that, instead of 63B, it's 64B. So
Right.
you would still have to kind of have that initiative or resource or effort to kind of stay on top of it. Ideally, we should
Gotcha.
get to a point where Microsoft, once they update it here, it would automatically update some built-in watch list in Sentinel. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet. So yeah.
Yeah. I would imagine like actual ideal situation is these things are not random application IDs and they are actually the application, the names, the actual names that they exist as. But I imagine there's probably some backend stuff happening in Microsoft as to why they have to use IDs instead of the actual names.
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, like in the logs, no one cares about like GUIDs and
Yeah.
things, right? We would want the actual meaningful names.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's why, like, I'm not trying to put my series out of work just yet. So if they start doing that, maybe there's not a need to decipher. So for now, we'll
True.
we'll, we'll leave it as it is. But yeah, maybe in the future they'll make it more simpler. But this page is a great find, right? So anyone watching in sort of security operations or SOC that deals with sort of Entra ID or Defender or Microsoft in general, this is a great page because any logs of any app IDs, you can easily work out what the application is if it's
Mhm.
listed here. So yeah, then we move on to kind of the key fields of note. What I like to say is like these are like what is relevant to this operation, like what is most relevant to the operation, right? Because these four things here we saw: creation time, user ID, result, client IP. These are kind of generic across the operations. And
Yeah.
app ID, again, even though it's got a value here, you can have multiple operations encompassing the Exchange Admin Center, right? But the parameters is what's actually told you about the configuration of, what's occurred in this command. So one thing we can see is the parameters.name.identity. Again, we have just a value here, right? What is, right? No idea. We'll explore this in a minute.
Yeah.
And then again, member value, again, this random string, again, who is this, right? This is
Hmm.
probably some sort of user ID in our tenant, but why is it just listed? Again, what you said earlier, like, why doesn't this show me like Joanna or Nesta or whoever the user is, right? And again, identity, we could probably make an educated guess to say this is going to be the role group, but again, 403C6EF, like, it doesn't mean anything to nobody, right? So this is kind of where the deciphering comes in. Any questions on that before I move on?
Yeah, again, I think it's just, pointing back to what we just talked about having these particular values come in as just random digits as to where if they actually have real names within Entra ID, why are they coming in as these weird values? But again, it points back into deciphering the URL.
Yeah, and one thing is, and we'll see this in a minute, but this member value here doesn't actually tie into Entra ID. So even though it's a user in your tenant,
Yeah,
this member value is like a specific value that gets assigned to the Exchange Online property of that user. So the only way to decipher it is using Exchange PowerShell. Like if you put this value A099 into Entra ID,
yeah,
it won't show anything, and we'll show you that in a minute. So firstly, the two fields to decipher are parameters.name.identity, which is that 403 string, and then parameters.name.member, which is the A09 string, right? Now, a pitfall to avoid, I just did touch on this, but just to show you, for those of you that read previous part, right? So we did search for a string there in Entra ID, and it didn't give any result. But is it any different here? Well, we can see here that when we do the search for the 403 string, which is the identity, no result, right? So is it a user or a group? We can't see any results here for users. And if we search for groups, again, you can see 0 groups found. So this proves that Entra ID isn't a useful resource in this case for deciphering the value. So we can check the second one, right? So parameters.name.member must tie back to some sort of user. So searching this in Entra ID surely would give us some results, but again, you can see no result, right? So how do we actually decipher this? So the value in the identity name.identity property is the GUID or globally unique identifier of the role group. You have to use Exchange PowerShell with the right permissions to resolve this, okay? And the permissions you need, I believe, are view only configuration. Yeah. So this is an Exchange online role. So you would typically, link this role to a role group, which is what we've done here, or you could just assign a user to this role explicitly. And from like a least privilege perspective, that's probably the best way to do it, because if
right.
you assign a user to a role group, that role group may have more roles than they need, right?
That is true.
And you could also look to build a custom role group. So maybe it only has the view only config and also the view only audit logs, which we explored in the first part. That
Yeah.
way, the user can only search the audit log and also retrieve like user behavior deciphering, like what we've done just now.
You could potentially just, if someone's going to be doing this, they're most likely going to be working on the security team. So you could just create a role group that contains all the necessary details for like viewing the audit logs as well as this and maybe any other necessary permissions, and then just only assign people who are on the security team to that role group so they can always access those permissions.
Correct, yeah. And there's a tool like Hawk. I'm not as knowledgeable on it just yet, but maybe in a few months we can revisit that. But Hawk is like a Microsoft forensics tool. And the way the documentation explains it is just like what you said. Create an Exchange role group, give it the view-only audit logs, give it the view-only config, view-only recipients, etc., and then assign members to that role group. And that way, then anyone that has that permission can also execute Hawk, because Hawk relies on those 3 permissions to execute. So yeah, maybe we can explore that. But I think, yeah, in summary, you're right. That's the best way to do it. Just make a custom role group, assign the specific permissions to it that your security team would need, and assign members to that. And then obviously when people leave and so on, they should be removed from the role group and stuff like that as part of your JML process. But yeah, so we can use Exchange PowerShell. So with Exchange PowerShell, just to kind of show your audience, basically you need to install the PowerShell module. So this docs page kind of goes through how you do that. You need to import the module, how you connect to it, how you authenticate to it. And once you're authenticated to it, you can basically run commands like get role group. Okay, so in this case, I'm running get role group. I'm specifying the string of 403, which if you remember, 403 was the name identity value. Okay, because we
Yeah.
suspected that this would be the role group because member is clearly a user, but identity is most likely a role. So if you do get role group, the string FL is format list, for in case your audience aren't aware. And then basically I'm just telling to get me specific properties like GUID, name, roles, and description. So when we do that, let me just make this image a bit bigger to see it. We can see that the GUID is obviously the value we expect. The name is IR audit logs reader. And if you remember, this is the role group we created in part 1 to give access to the audit logs. You can see the roles are view only audit log, right? Again, if I added the view only config role to that role group, when I ran this command, there would be a comma here and then view only config, right? So this roles property would expand to show kind of all the roles in the role group. And again, we see the description, and this description is what we specified when we created the role group, right?
Yeah.
So basically from this, we know that the role group that the user user was added to was IR audit logs reader, and we can see some metadata about the group, right? Now, one thing is if we go back to the screenshot in the first screenshot that we had, which is this one here, which basically shows you the audit event, one thing you notice, oh, sorry, it's kind of zoomed in quite a bit. Let me do that differently. Yeah, here, right? If you look at this a bit, you can actually see that there's an item property, and this item property is IR audit logs reader, which is exactly the name of the role group. So
Right.
why do they bother putting the identity value here when the role group name is there, right?
Yeah.
Item is there, and also there's another one called object. Yeah, you can see here object ID IR audit logs reader, right?
Mm.
It's just like you're making it more complicated for no reason,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. I've heard
So
some people say things along the lines of the different teams at Microsoft are just like working in silos. So nobody knows what anyone's working on, and everyone just like does different things. And then then that you get to a point where you're getting things like this, where you're getting both the ID, the random string, and also getting that same object ID within the logs as well. And it's duplicated essentially multiple times when it could have just come in like, as the actual details, where that was like the role name or the specific roles that are within that particular log.
yeah, yeah. But exactly like you said, like nobody knows. I've exactly put it in here. Like, why does Microsoft hide this? No one knows, right? But yeah, you could be right with your silo comment. I think that's definitely true. Like, I mean, you can just see that in sort of the different elements of the portals, right? Like, for example, some of your audience may be aware of 365 Defender, which is like the XDR suite. If you look at like Defender for Endpoint, which is a component within that, and then you look at Defender for Office, some of the kind of, editing a policy, some of them will have like pencil icon, some of them will have like an edit button. Like there's just no
Mhm.
consistency between them. And maybe that's something they're working towards. But yeah, for now, it seems like a lot of the properties in the audit log aren't as useful, or they do repeat, or they make them more complicated. But yeah, that's just something to mention. So that's basically the first field successfully deciphered, right? So now we know that 403 is basically the IR audit logs reader. But if you remember, we had a second value to decipher, which was the name member, this A09. So for that one, again, we use Exchange PowerShell. With this one, I think it might be slightly different permissions. Let me check. Yeah, so this one is view only recipients, right? If you remember the first one, you needed view only config role, but for the second one, you need view only recipients. And again, going back to your point about the role group, from a security perspective, maybe you want a role group with the view only recipients role, view only config role, and the view only audit logs role, which would then empower your security teams to not only search the audit logs, but also do this kind of deciphering. But yeah, just to stress that here you need the view only recipients role, because here you're querying like user metadata. View only config is more around the setup of Exchange, which is like role groups, potentially transport rules, things like that, like what you actually specify when you set up Exchange Online or
Yeah.
as you mature Exchange Online. Whereas recipients are like your user properties, like your members in the tenants, mailbox properties and things like that. So again, we use Exchange PowerShell, similar command, but this time it's get user. So we do get user. Again, I can make this bit bigger. So if we do get user slash, the string like A09, again, we can do FT, format table. Again, I'm telling it, give me the GUID, give me the user principal name and the name. And this is again what you get. So in this case, it's someone called Nestor W is the user that's been added, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we can then conclude, that Nestor W was added to the role group. Sorry, what are you going to say?
No, no, no. It was just blowing my mind the fact that, if you're in an actual investigation, right, where this, an alert came up as to someone, was added to a role group or whatever the case is in this scenario, and you had to investigate this, you would need to have all this context to properly investigate this, except if you already have all the systems in place with like your SIM, all that data being like, populated. But if you don't have all of those fancy tools and fancy things, like you're gonna have to go through this entire process. Except, I mean, again, you could also probably automate some of this stuff, like probably just have a script that runs all of these things and gives you all the details. But the fact that all of these things are like, very they're cryptic in a way, it's just like very interesting as to also seeing like how that ties back into incident response, because a lot of things within incident response is the speed of your response, because the attacker is like probably present within your environment. So just going through all of this is like actually very, very interesting to say the least.
And also you have a SLA for incidents, right? So some companies may have like 48
True.
hours, 72 hours, etc. And anytime you're spending kind of, for lack of a better word, just clutching at straws to try and figure this out, you're wasting
Yeah.
time. So it's much better to, have these kind of processes documented. Yeah, you could look into the script option, like you said. And one thing I'd really encourage people to do is try their own scenarios. Maybe your
Mm,
company offers you some sort of playground environment. Do this kind of behavior yourself so that when you then have to do it for an incident, you can do it much more quickly. And one thing you may be thinking of, or maybe your audiences, is why don't you have a watch list of like your users, with the IDs and the names? You could do, but again, one, what if your company has like 100,000 users? Are you really going to have that as a watch list? There might be a limit on how many, rows in Excel, CSV you could
yeah.
have. One, two, you'd have to maintain that again. If someone's name changes because they get married or whatever, right? Does their user ID then change? Potentially. Do they then get a
Mm,
new user ID? Potentially. So you have to keep an eye on that. People
mm,
leaving, joining, etc. But again, we go back to the same point earlier that maybe Microsoft could, as well as giving you the A09 value, it shouldn't be hard for them to pull Nesta W, right?
yeah.
And then even if you need to go into Entra to really understand what does the W stand for, or things of that nature, in case you've got multiple people like that, then you could do that. But at least it would give you some sort of starting ground rather than just the A09 value you can't do anything with, right?
Yeah.
So, and then, yeah, then we come on to sort of the detection engineering piece, right? So what can you do after you've kind of investigated this? So firstly, there is a default alert policy for this kind of activity. Hopefully they haven't changed the docs page. No, they haven't. So there's an alert called elevation of Exchange admin privilege, which is basically an automatic alert generated when someone's given permissions in Exchange Online. Now, the way this works is any role in Exchange Admin Center is counted as privilege. So even if you give someone view-only audit logs or view-only config, etc., it will still count this as a admin permission. So these kind of alerts could be quite noisy because in my eyes, the more dangerous role groups are the ones that actually allow you to make changes. If you're kind of just viewing static data, it's not as much a concern. It could be if,
Hmm.
for example, the user isn't intended for that role, right? So if you do, deal with these alerts, then just bear in mind they can be quite noisy and there's no real way to tune them, at least currently, because they're kind of a built-in alert and Microsoft doesn't reveal the kind of detection logic behind it at the moment. So maybe that's something you could then do with your SIM, which we'll come to in a minute, right? Where you can
Sure.
get a bit more tailored. But yeah, that's the default alert policy. And here's an example of how the audit event for that default alert policy looks like. Sorry, not the audit event, but the actual alert in the portal. So you can see here, this is the alert, elevation of Exchange admin privilege. Again, this would show you the user that on that change, what happened. Again, very vague description. One thing that's good though is they have added activity list here, which basically, in my eyes, seems to lift and shift from the audit log. And here it's pulling out the very specific fields that you'd care about, right? It's giving you
Right.
the operation. So you can see add role group member, which is what we've just explored. The user would be, I think, the user that got added to the role group. I have redacted this again. I'm not sure why I did, but I think it would be the user. And then the item would be obviously the role group. And again, IP address we saw, right? So this, like going back to your point about investigations, if someone is looking at this in the portal, it does a better job, at least, from what I'm used to in the past, of kind of
Yeah.
bringing the key bits from an audit log perspective. But what if your what if your SOC isn't using the native portal? What if they're relying on Splunk or Sentinel? How much of this kind of visual would come to Sentinel or Splunk? Probably not much, right? The
Yeah.
whole thing is that you need to kind of go into the portal to investigate. That's kind of how Microsoft does it. But this is a value add of using the portal as well.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah. I
yeah,
remember.
only, oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, no worries. I remember having a similar experience, like I think 2 years ago. I was working as a threat analyst for a client that was really big on using like a bunch of Microsoft Suite, and we'll get these alerts in Splunk, but would have to still go into, well, then it was called Azure AD, to like kind of triage and then look at all the details, and then come back into Splunk to maybe do some correlation. But yeah, the fact that Microsoft does surface these alerts but hides the actual like querying or the actual logic behind them is also kind of weird, because it could, if Microsoft's alerts become too noisy, you could probably just lift and shift that logic into your own SIM and then probably use it, like probably customize it to your own use case and your own environment, so that way it's like a lot more actionable. But it's still cool though, like they give you like the most important things, which is the date, the activity, the user, and then other details that are important for the alert.
Yeah, no, and that's a good segue because if it is going to a third-party SIEM or Sentinel, right, you can create a custom alert for when specific members are added to role groups. So again,
Ah,
let's say you've got a watch list of like potential insider threats. You want to know if they're potentially added to role groups, right? And again, you could create a custom alert for when members are added to role groups with specific roles. Like again, we looked at only kind of the view-only roles, right? But there are, like organization management is quite a privileged role. So you would see that in the audit event, which is where did it go? Here, right? So you could have, for example, if you know the role groups that are quite sensitive, sensitive, you could get that string, like the GUID of that role group, right? And then set up a detection that if someone's added to this role group, let me know about it.
Mhm.
Or again, you could use the object ID property. So you could say where object ID equals organization management, for example. So yeah, I think overall, this part was useful to show your audience kind of two fields how you have to decipher. In this case, we deciphered the role group identity and also the member that was added. And again, we've shown, with sort of sending the logs to a SIM, how you can build a bit more custom tailored detections, because the built-in policy, as we saw, or as we know now, is kind of hard to modify since Microsoft don't reveal the detection logic. But yeah, that's part 3. Any questions on that?
No, that's yeah, it's like a slow build up from starting from how to set up the logs and then going into the second one, and then now you're starting to see like the different aspect of Microsoft login and like all the, I guess, sort of shortcomings, but also like it's looking at it and thinking about it, it's sort of like a balance between their shortcomings and also like things that are good about them, and yeah, just being able to look at that as well, because I have spent not a decent amount of time like just going through some sort of like Microsoft stuff, but looking at all the different things that I might have missed out or I might have not fully understood, and kind of being a lot more acclimated to it by actually going through this is very helpful. I think like anyone who's like working within like a Microsoft environment, whether you're using like Defender, Exchange specifically, it's gonna be very helpful with like helping you, whether you want to automate this process, whether you want to just like create the specific role groups like the security one that could help with this as well, or maybe that even looks like creating specific things within your SIM to enrich the data with those cryptic GUIDs or strings, and make your detections a lot more actionable. So thanks for going over that.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Thank you so much for watching this episode. In the meantime, you can check out the other videos in the Detection Opportunity series over here, or the next video right over here. I'll see you there.